Welcome to the Cold Case Christianity broadcast, the only Christian case-making program hosted by a cold case homicide detective. J. Warner Wallace has been investigating cold case murders in Los Angeles County for over a decade. His work has been featured on Fox News, Court TV, and Dateline. For more information about Jim's work and the case for Christianity, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. Now, here's your host, J. Warner Wallace.
Thanks for joining us at Cold Case Christianity. I'm J. Warner Wallace. This week, I'm going to show you a clip from a presentation I did at the 2015 AMP conference that is run and held by Reasons to Believe, a wonderful organization in which great scientific thinkers and theologians come together to make up a staff of Christian case makers who are able to kind of demonstrate how science can actually make the case for God's existence. That's at reasons.org. And you'll see a link there to the upcoming AMP conferences. This particular conference was an effort on the part of all the speakers to provide the audience with a tool set that might help them make the case for what they believe, to evangelize, to share Jesus with the people in their culture. And my talk was all about the nature of evidence and how if we master the nature of evidence, it'll help us to communicate what we believe as Christians. So I hope you enjoyed this presentation, which is really about the nature of evidence and how mastering it can help you become a better evangelist and a better Christian case maker.
So I want to share with you some things that I've learned, stuff I've learned about evidence that I learned before I started looking at the evidence for Christianity. First thing I learned about evidence is simply this. Well, what is evidence? Everything is evidence. Hear me on that. You might think, well, only certain things would count as, no, actually, everything counts. When I walk into a crime scene, I know that everything counts as evidence. Sometimes I'm looking at, just forensic physical evidence. But there's lots of stuff in the room that's not physical, lots of parts of the case that aren't physical. Those also count. I don't need physical evidence to make a case. I've got a couple of cases that I didn't have a single piece of physical evidence, yet we still convicted our guy. There's times when, where the victim is attacked is important to me, but also where he could have been attacked but wasn't is important to me. Starting to see a pattern here? What was discovered at the crime scene, that could be important. What's not discovered, what's missing from the crime scene is important. Whatever the suspect said, by the way, my daughter hates this part. I will hold against you everything you say in an interview. But I will also hold against you everything you could have said but didn't. So basically, she's like, I can't win. Whatever I say, you're going to hold. If I don't say it, you're going to hold. Yes, that's right. You can't win. That's the way it's designed. So what you fail to say is this is important. And whatever you did, that's going to be important. What you could have done but failed to do is also, do you see the pattern here? It's the is and the is nots. The what is and what is, everything counts as evidence. Brothers and sisters, I'm here to tell you that if you think we're going to have to make a case based on certain forms of evidence, and if we don't have those forms of evidence, we can't make a case, you're wrong. Because everything, as a matter of fact, the more you take this approach and realize that everything counts as evidence, the more creative you become. When you start looking at the pronoun use of ancient documents from Egypt to Palestine, and you realize that the pronouns used in the biblical documents are exactly the same pronouns that really were in use in that area in the first century. Well, who would even think of looking at pronouns? Somebody who gets it, somebody who knows that everything is evidence. Make sense? Second thing I learned is that there really are two forms that everything falls into. All that evidence falls into two categories. And there are only two categories of evidence. The first one is pretty simple. It's what we call direct evidence. The other one is what we call indirect evidence. Not really hard to imagine those two different kinds, right? Well, what is direct evidence? Direct evidence is just eyewitness testimony, folks. If someone says to you, I need some direct evidence on this, what are they talking about? And I hear this all the time. I'm watching a series on Netflix called The Making of a Murderer. Have you guys seen that? And even the prosecutor, when talking about the nature of evidence, misuses the terms. Direct evidence is eyewitness testimony. That's all that counts as direct evidence. Indirect evidence is everything else. Well, DNA at the crime scene, that's not direct evidence. That's indirect evidence. Witnesses who can tell you what they saw the suspect do, that is direct eyewitness testimony. That's all that counts. Now, sometimes we use a different word for this indirect evidence. We call this circumstantial evidence. So these are the two groups. And I'll bet you when you hear this term, circumstantial evidence, you're like, that's just junk. You hear on TV all the time, all they have is a circumstantial case, right? Well, that's all I ever have. I work cold cases. They went cold for a reason. There's no eyewitnesses. So when I get a case to begin with, it's terrible. It's a mess. And it's built on circumstantial evidence. But we can still, as a matter of fact, judges tell juries all the time that they are not to consider circumstantial evidence as being any less valuable than direct evidence. They are to be given the exact same weight in your jury deliberations. So stop saying it's just a circumstantial case, because that means there's something less about no, it's a circumstantial case. But it's not just a circumstantial case. Does that make sense? As a matter of fact, let me show you the jury instruction. Here's what judges tell juries in jury trials before they start the deliberations. Both direct and circumstantial evidence are acceptable types of evidence to prove or disprove the elements of a charge, including intent and mental state and acts necessary to a conviction. And neither is necessarily more reliable than the other. Neither is entitled to any greater weight than the other. So I'm here to tell you guys, we build cases about the existence of God that could be described as circumstantial. No kidding. That's how we do cases, and probably 85% of cases in America are entirely circumstantial. That's how we build cases. Don't let anyone tell you that you've got to have a direct witness you can interview in order to believe something is true. Be ready to kiss down all of history then. You couldn't even know anything about your own great-grandparents if you had to have somebody alive who could say, I saw them do this. No, you're taking it on the strength of somebody else's testimony. You have to make these cases circumstantially. So just know that that's an entirely appropriate way to make a case. That's okay. Something else I learned about evidence. There's a big difference between what is possible and what is reasonable. Anything is possible. We don't even count possible. Possible doesn't matter to me in a jury trial. Hey, it's 9:15, a little bit later than 9:15. How do you even know you're here? You could be oversleeping right now. You could be in a dream state right now, dreaming about being here this morning. And if you think, well, I can test that, I can ask the person next to me, or I can pinch myself, that could just be part of your dream. That's possible. You have to at least admit it's possible you're just dreaming all this. But it's not reasonable. Anything is possible, but not everything is reasonable. And that's why, folks, our jury standard, the standard of proof in the most difficult criminal trials, is not beyond a possible doubt. It's beyond a reasonable doubt. Why? Because if it was beyond a possible doubt, you'd never convict anybody. You'll always have some possible doubts, but reasonable doubts are things that are grounded in evidence. You're not to speculate during jury deliberation about possibilities. You're just to infer reasonably from evidences. That brings me to something else I want to talk about. Every case has unanswered questions. I've never worked a case that I could prove beyond a possible doubt. That's not the standard. It's beyond a reasonable. Why? Because you're always going to have some possible doubts. Always. Because you could dream of all kinds of imaginary possibilities to answer a question. But those don't count. Here's a case from about 1981. This man killed his wife and got rid of her body and then told us in 1981 that she had run off. And we believed it. We took a missing persons report. We didn't work it as a homicide until 1987. 6 years later, there wasn't a single piece of physical evidence. I couldn't tell you how he killed her, where he killed her, what he did with her body. I couldn't tell you any of that stuff. I couldn't tell you how he moved her car. All the jury had about 5 or 6 key, important, unanswered questions. They convicted this guy in about 4 hours because on the strength, basically, of his changing story over time. But no one believed us. Keith Morrison at Dateline, the first question out of his mouth was, Jim, why do you think this is the guy? I don't think he's the guy. You haven't got any physical evidence. You've got very little on this case. No one believed us. His family, of course, didn't believe he was guilty. The victim's family loved this guy like a son-in-law. They didn't want to believe he was guilty either. But at the sentencing, he confessed to all of us and gave us the location of the body. You're able to convict somebody even with huge unanswered questions because you don't have to answer every question. You'll never answer every question. I'm here to tell you, brothers and sisters, you are going to hold a view called Christianity for which you cannot answer every question. That's okay. That's the nature of every worldview, is built on some unanswered questions. The question really is, how big and significant are ours compared to the other worldviews? I think we get a lot closer and we shrink the gap of unanswered questions more than anybody else. But just keep in mind, we have a jury instruction for this. It says the evidence need not eliminate all possible doubt because everything in life is open to some possible or imaginary doubt. This is what we tell jurors. If this is good enough to decide whether someone's going to go to jail or be executed, it's good enough for you to make a decision about a worldview. You cannot eliminate all possible doubts. Something else I learned, and I want to finish with this today, and that is the cumulative nature of evidence. The more cumulative the case, the more robust the collection of evidence is, the stronger the inference. Now, in Cold Case Christianity, a book I wrote, I talk about this particular murder scene in which I've got a guy who's been accused of murdering his girlfriend with this baseball bat. As I assemble a case entirely circumstantial from 8 important pieces of evidence, a baseball bat that he's bleached, a lie about his alibi, he's already talked about beating his girlfriend in the past, and on the day of the murder, he actually threatened to kill her, and he's got a pair of shoes that were seen by a witness. There are like only 30 in the entire county even exist, and he's driving a car. Only 1 or 2 cars like this exist in the entire county. This case is an entirely circumstantial case that is built cumulatively. The more pieces I have, the better it would be. I would probably never go to trial with an 8-piece case. Usually my case is around 80 pieces. I call this death by 1,000 paper cuts. Because the more we have, the more obvious the inference. He's either incredibly unlucky, and these things just happen to align perfectly to make him look guilty, or he's just incredibly guilty because he is the one common causal factor that unifies all the evidence set. I'm looking for common causal factors. Make sense? Now, you might say to yourself, well, gosh, cumulative cases. I've seen philosophers talk about this. You really can't trust a cumulative case because it only gives you a certain level of probability. It doesn't give you 100% certainty. Well, we already talked about, do we need 100% certainty? It's not beyond a possible doubt, it's beyond a reasonable doubt. That's number one. But I'll see philosophers sometimes say, well, it seems like cumulative cases are kind of like this likelihood principle of confirmation theory. Just that title sounds impressive, doesn't it? I've heard other people say, well, how would you figure out what the odds are that one of those pieces of evidence could be explained in some other way or have to be explained by way of your suspect? How would you even calculate the odds on each piece and how it relates to the total? Some people will put it this way. There seems to be a similarity between Bayesian theories, Bayesian logic, the Bayes theorem, odds form of Bayes' theorem. This is a way that some philosophers try to reconcile the probability problems. They're really trying to figure out which of 2 options is more reasonable. Which of 2 hypotheses, H1 or H2, is more reasonable? Now, can you imagine if I had a jury in place and I said, okay, tell you what, we're about to enter into a process of using Bayes' theorem. They're going to go, what? Yeah, when you look at these possibilities, we're trying to figure out if H1 or H2 is possible, I simply want you to go back in the jury room and run every single piece of evidence through Bayes, the odds form of Bayes' theorem. Here it is. Just take this theorem and run it for every piece of evidence. Could you imagine? Could you imagine taking that approach with the jury? It's not going to get you real far. We have actually a different, by the way, this is why we don't put philosophers on jurors, okay? We don't put philosophers on juries because in the end, they make a mess of your case. Because what we're going to ask the jury to do, instead of trying to use a complicated theorem, we're going to ask them to do something that's a little less complicated. We're going to ask them to use their common sense. Seriously. This is something else I've learned about evidence. Your common sense is sufficient. Christians, hear me on this. You do not have to be an expert in any one of these disciplines in order to know the truth about what the evidence infers. Experts testify in every criminal trial. They do not serve on my jury. As a matter of fact, the experts who testify on jury trials do not get a vote. It's people like you and me, regular citizens who are engaged, interested, and see their duty who get to serve on juries. As a matter of fact, if you've got a level of expertise in something, if you are an electrician and I've got an electrical fire, kind of a murder, I am not going to put you on my jury. Because I guarantee you, when I call that electrical expert to testify, your pride's going to puff up and you're going to think, I know something better than he does. You'll make a mess of my jury. I'm more likely to take you off a jury if you have some level of expertise about something. I just want smart, passionate, engaged jurors. So just trust me on this. You don't have to be an expert. And you're about to hear from the best experts, I think, in this field. But you don't have to be one of those in order to make good sense of what they're telling us. That's what we do as juries all the time. Let me give you an example of this. If a friend of mine, Bill, came to me and said, I got this son. He's a great kid, and he's just been a good kid. But the last couple of months, he's been acting a little bit squirrely. I'm not quite sure what to make of his activity. I think maybe he's having problems. Well, what do you mean? Well, last night, he's supposed to come home at 10 o'clock. And sure enough, I fell asleep. He didn't get home until after 1 o'clock. So I went out to the front curb this morning to see his car is parked there, but it's parked at the curb kind of like sideways. It's like, who parks a car like that? Half of it was ticked out. And I see the car's not parked right, so I walk up to it, and I see on the ground next to the driver's side door, there's a crumpled up receipt. So I picked it up, and sure enough, it's from the liquor store down the street. It's like for a 12-pack. I thought, wow, he was kind of shocked by that. So the next morning, my kid gets up like 3 hours late. He looks like a totally different kid. Didn't even know it was him. He looked terrible. Not only that, he was wearing the clothes he was in last night. Apparently, he slept in those clothes. And his shirt was a mess, and looked like he threw up on it or something, and it smelled terrible like alcohol. He went right to the cupboard, got out some aspirin. He wasn't feeling good. I'm not quite sure what to make of this. Well, Bill, if you were on a jury, I would ask you to use the odds form of Bayes' theorem to try to figure out what that all means. No, we're going to say, hey, use your common sense, Bill. You've got a good cumulative case here for something that happened with your son last night. You could ignore it. I have to have 100% certainty. I think I've got beyond a reasonable doubt, but I hate to move without 100% certainty. Really? We tell jurors this all the time. Whether they're deciding about witnesses, whether they're deciding about use of force, you are allowed to use your common sense. I even had a jury one time come back and say, hey, can we use our common sense on this? Yeah. Now, I think there's a similar cumulative case that you could build for the existence of God, and I try to do this in God's crime scene. 8 pieces of evidence in the universe. I could have easily put in 38 pieces of evidence, but these 8 I thought were compelling. A universe that has a beginning, a universe that appears to be fine-tuned, the origin of life from non-life, the appearance of design in biology, the existence of mind and of free agency and of objective, transcendent moral truths, and of evil. Everyone knows these things exist in the universe, and everyone has an equal burden of proof to explain how it is that their worldview will account for these things. That's an equal burden. I think there is a one common causal factor that can explain all of it. God. Now, of course, these are all illustrations. By the way, if you spend 9 years, I was an architect before I became a cop, so my whole background is in design and art. So what I got out of that 9 years of art school is I don't have to pay an illustrator. I can do my own drawings. That's all I got out of that. Now, if I wanted to just take one piece of this, the appearance of design in biology, how do we make that case? This is a garrote. This is a murder device that was left at a crime scene in 1979 in our city. A garrote is simply a strangulation device or a cutting device, 2 wooden handles, a piece of wire between. The murderer who used this panicked and left it. We found it underneath the body of the victim. Now, the officers, when they got there, immediately collected it. Why? Because they knew that it was an artifact. It was a designed weapon, which means you have to have an artisan who is the designer in order to account for it. They didn't leave it and think, oh, it could be a broken piece of the bed. It could be a broken piece of the plant next to the bed. No, they said, this looks like something that's been designed. Well, how do they know it's been designed? Cumulative case. So in the book, I try to show you, from my own background as a designer, 8 things that I think are indicative of design. And yes, I use this stupid acronym, designed, because Frank Turek forced me to use an acronym. I sent him the book. He says, dude, you need an acronym for that. I said, no, I don't. He says, yes, you do. So this acronym is so stupid, but it's Frank Turek's fault, okay? But I think if you look at this, can you say that how much time and chance would have to occur in order for these things to come together in this form? That's not reasonable. When you look at it, you see something you recognize. The officers in the 70s, when they saw this, they recognized it immediately. Why? Because they had seen The Godfather, in which there are 2 garrote murderers, and they knew that those garrotes had been designed, so it was reasonable to infer that this garrote was designed. They also knew that there's a certain level of sophistication in the kinds of bunch line hitched knots that were at the end of the wire. That kind of sophistication is not much, but it was enough for them to realize this had been designed. And when we actually did a search warrant years later at his house, I realized that only one group of people has ever used and been trained to use and build garrotes that I can find, and those are naval aviators in World War II, of which my suspect's father was one and had all kinds of paraphernalia at his house. Informationally dependent. He knew he had a book that he could actually read to see how to build it. There's goal-directed. If I was trying to cut clay or wax or wire, or cheese, for example, this doesn't need these kinds of handles. The fact I'm putting the handles on means I'm trying to achieve a different kind of goal. It's goal-directed. Not only that, what laws of physics could account for those? Could some law of physics or chemistry put that together that way? I don't think so. And there's a certain amount of irreducible complexity. Although it's only 3 pieces that are necessary, you just won't work with just one handle. You need both handles and the wire to make it work. And anytime you see more than one thing additively existing in a design object, you know it's a designed object. It's hard for this to emerge in place because there's 3 pieces that have to emerge together. And finally, there's a certain decision he made in using that. Why did he use that? Because she lived right next door to 2 other tenants in that house, and he knew if he shot her or stabbed her, she'd make noise. This he could use silently. This is the cumulative case for design. That's why these officers were smart to collect this. Now, let's apply this to something else. Here, for example, is a bougainvillea tree. In my bougainvillea tree in my front yard, we constantly find birds' nests. If you looked at that, would you say, wow, look what the wind, and look what grows in these trees? That's amazing to me that these trees grow. Or would you say, no, this is probably more reasonably explained as the result of a designer, in this case, intelligent birds. Well, how would you know? Template, 8 pieces, same template. If you look at these 8 pieces, you see the same 8 attributes of design, even in the nest. And if you said, well, I'm not sure, Jim. I'm not sure I really see information. I don't think birds were reading a book about how to do this. Okay, take some of these out. If you don't think we've got irreducible complexity or maybe we have some choices here, fine. Even if you were to take out those 3 elements, you still have more than enough reason to believe this is design. You're not going to take those 3 attributes out and go, well, see, there you go. It's not designed. No, you know the bird's nest is designed, even though it may only have 5 of the 8 attributes. This is the beauty of cumulative cases. When defense attorneys want to nitpick about 3 or 4, take them. Take them. There's still enough reason to convict this guy. Enter Michael Behe. He kind of introduced us to this icon of intelligent design, right? In this book called Darwin's Black Box, where he talks about this bacterial flagellum. This motor that exists inside bacteria, it's a rotary motor that's in the wall built from 40 proteins that come together in a clock-like manner, directed, by the way, by DNA formation here. It produces a tail that can whip, change direction instantly, and has an incredibly large RPM. This rotary engine is powered electronically in rotary fashion. It's unbelievable. Even naturalists have called this a miracle, not meaning that it's a miracle from God, but it's amazing, let's put it that way. How do we explain this thing? Lots of folks have pointed to this as an icon, a proof that a designer is by far the best explanation for this, rather than some kind of natural processes. But how do we make that case? We make it cumulatively. Same 8 pieces are here, and all of them are present in the bacterial flagellum. Behe, in his book, really focuses more in on irreducible complexity. He's right to do so. He's not the only one who's talked about this, though. As you know, Stephen C. Meyer talks about really DNA information and molecular machines like this. He's also right. Fuzz has written a book on this. I used it for my book. By the way, Fuzz is a great source, as you know, for all these things. And he talks really about a little bit, I was really glad to see him talk about pattern recognition. If you've got something you know is designed, rotary engines, and you see one over here, why not assume this has been designed too? And of course, William Dembski, who's probably written one of the first kind of seminal books on design, talks about if it cannot be explained through chance or natural law, the next best inference is design. Everyone's right, but it's the cumulative case that makes it so strong. Because even if you said, Jim, I don't see certain things, I don't buy what you're saying about certain aspects of this case. Fine, take those out. Like the bird's nest, even with less than all 8 pieces, there's more than enough reason to infer design. That is the beauty of cumulative cases. That's why if we were to go walking in the woods in the forest and we were to come across in the middle of this path a motor on a stand, we would not say, wow, look what grows in the woods. right? Because you'd be doing the same thing, same process, and you're using all cumulatively 8 pieces that point to the same reasonable conclusion. Last thing, the more diverse your cumulative case is, the more reasonable the inference. Remember the guy who killed the girl with the garrote? This is him at 63 when I finally took him to jail. He was sentenced last year. It was a 2-hour Dateline episode. He was 27 when he killed her. Now, how do we make the case? On the basis of different forms of evidence. We had some eyewitness testimony, not about what he saw him do. No one saw him do it, but things they saw him actually behave in certain ways. And in fact, we also had some physical evidence, the garrote and some other jewelry. And we had some statements on his part that pointed to him. All that being said, this is a very different process. Of eyewitness testimony, we examine that differently. We examine behavioral evidence differently. We examine forensic evidence differently. Different sets of principles are used to examine these very different forms of evidence. When you have different forms of evidence that point to the same reasonable conclusion, it's a better even conclusion than before. Same thing happens here. 8 pieces of evidence, but they're in 4 very different categories that are examined very differently. Different sciences are used for cosmological evidence than are used for biological evidence. A different set of philosophical arguments is used for mental evidence, moral evidence. And in spite of the diversity, the incredible diversity of the kinds of evidence, guess what? There's one common causal factor which makes the most sense of this: God. For years, we've been talking about how to unify quantum theories, say, with other theories of gravity involving larger things. And we call this, we wish we could find this thing we call a theory of everything. I'm here to tell you, there is a theory of everything. He's called God.
Be sure to download the free Cold Case Christianity app from the iTunes Store and the Android Marketplace. The Cold Case Christianity app puts all the resources from coldcasechristianity.com in the palm of your hand. You can read the daily blog, listen to podcasts, and watch videos from within the application. And Jim uses the app to send direct messages to fans of Cold Case Christianity. The app will also link you to all Cold Case Christianity social media and provide you with a direct connection to J. Warner Wallace. Download the app today and become a better Christian casemaker. Thanks for joining us at the Cold Case Christianity broadcast. If you're interested in more information about this week's topic, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. For a thorough investigation of the reliability of the New Testament Gospels and the case for Christianity, be sure to purchase Cold Case Christianity. A homicide detective investigates the claims of the Gospels. It's available wherever books are sold.